Hello and welcome to Arts Alive Books. Joining me in the studio tonight is author Cecil Lowry, whose books 2 Years of Tenko, Life as a 16-year-old in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and No Mercy from the Japanese, a survivor's account of the Burma Railway and the Hell Ships, are gripping eyewitness accounts of some of the most awful periods in the history of the British Army. Later in the show, Luca Veste tells us about his new book, Bloodstream, and fellow presenter Jerry Smith previews his involvement with the Liverpool Irish Festival. But first, Cecil Lowry. Cecil, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. I'd love you to start by just telling us just a little bit about each book in turn and just filling our viewers in on some of the key things you think are important about them.
Sure. Can I start with No Mercy from the Japanese,
of course, yeah.
Which came out about 6 or 7 years ago. This was a book told by John Wyatt, a man in the same regiment as my father. My father was a prisoner of war with the Japanese and fought in Malaya. John Wyatt was in his regiment, and it's basically his story. I set about 7 years ago to try and find someone who might have known my father.
And did they know each other?
They didn't know each other, no. John said he didn't know him, and he actually said that he was a conscript and my father was a regular soldier, which basically meant the conscripts kept to themselves and the regulars tended to keep to themselves. So he didn't know my father, but everything that he did almost mirrored what my father went through.
And it was horrific.
It was an horrific time for all of them. My father came back in 1945 after the Japanese surrendered. He was about 12 stone when he went there, and he was 6 stone when he came home.
It's a real survival spirit tale as well, though, isn't it? It's a story of immense courage and of faith as well, faith in God, actually.
Exactly. If you read John Wyatt's book, you will see that his Catholic faith kept him going through, and I'm sure that the faith kept a lot of the men alive through their captivity and through their conflicts in the Malayan Peninsula. Of course, there were quite a lot of padres from all religions with them, and also in the prison camps. There was a padre in nearly every prison camp.
What would you say was the most challenging experience that John Wyatt had?
The most challenging experience, you really need to read the book. The most challenging experience was probably what's called the Hell Ships, where he was taken from Singapore to Japan to work in the factories to aid the Japanese war effort. One ship ran aground and was sunk. He was transferred to another. There were men dying in the holds. That's probably the most poignant experience.
Do you think that's the one that challenged him most in terms of his survivor spirit?
Without a shadow of a doubt, that's the one that challenged him most. He said that, he told me in interviews that twice he'd given up, and it was only his great friend, Mick Shields, that pulled him through.
Okay, and I think actually you've got some beautiful pictures in the text as well. Probably won't be able to see it on camera, but there's a picture at the back of him of Mick Shields in Dublin in 1945, isn't there?
That's correct. That's correct. And Mick Shields was his best man at his wedding.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what about this text? Elizabeth van Kampen, and this is a picture of her on the back, which you took yourself, I understand.
I did indeed. Elizabeth van Kampen is a Dutch lady, and I stumbled across her when I was doing some research, just general research on that area. And she was 16 years of age when the Japanese invaded Java. You know that they took over the whole of the Far East, and they'd set their sights even as far as Australia. She was taken prisoner with her family and her father on Java. Her mother and her 2 sisters were taken away to a women's camp, and her father was taken to a men's camp, which is what the Japanese did at that time. She loved her father dearly.
That really comes across in the text, actually, and also the terrible kind of shock that obviously, and there's a photograph of her father at the end of the text. He dies ultimately, doesn't he? And she's about 19 when she hears he's died. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. After the war, they lost touch with her father. After the war, nobody could find out where he'd been. They had to come home without him to Holland. And then later on, they discovered that he died in one of the camps, and that they think that he actually died a matter of 2 months before the Japanese surrendered.
That's so sad. Is it a privilege to work with people who've been through such life-defining experiences so young?
Oh, an incredible experience. an absolutely incredible experience.
You work closely with them to help them shape their stories, don't you?
That's correct. That's correct. It has been difficult to get them to open up.
Well, particularly, I think, in the case of John Wyatt, you talk about kind of encouraging him to speak, because, of course, silence is a major strategy that these people had to employ in order to be able to move forwards, not to talk about it.
That's correct. And when they came back, they didn't talk about it. Lots of them didn't talk about it. In fact, they were actually told not to talk about it.
Who by?
The government and the military. The military. And there is a document, I have a document, the original document that my father kept, that told them what they could and couldn't do. They weren't allowed to speak to the press. And they didn't speak to anybody about it. And as I was growing up, my father never told me about it. I just knew somewhere that he'd been a prisoner out there. Yeah. And it wasn't until after he died that I became immersed in this subject. So
it's not just silence by choice as a kind of stiff upper lip thing, but more a kind of enforced silence
as well. In the early days, an enforced silence. But obviously, as the years went by, a lot of them have come out and spoke about it. When I went to visit John Wyatt in his house, he opened up to me dramatically. And that's how the seeds of this book were sown. When he told me his story over lunch one day, I was just absolutely blown away by this story. An immense story of courage.
Was it the courage that struck you more than the suffering? Because as I read these books, the suffering is visceral and it's really hard to stomach.
I think it was the courage to endure the suffering that sums it up. But John originally wouldn't speak about it too much, and he didn't want it published. And I went away thinking, oh, he doesn't want me to write this up. Because I said this story has to go out so that the next generation can read about this. Yeah, he didn't want to. And he called me up 2 weeks later, and he said, I've changed my mind.
That's amazing.
And I said, well, what's caused that? And he had two daughters, has two daughters. And he said, I've discussed it with my daughters, and they think I should have it in print.
You're passionate about encouraging young people now to learn more about the past, aren't you?
Yes, indeed.
I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that, but also whether you could talk about whether you think it's a difficult balance between remembering and moving forward into a global world, obviously, where we're trying to think about the future rather than the past.
Exactly. It's always going to be a difficult balance, Mari. But I think it's important that the children know what went on 70 years ago or 100 years ago or whenever. Yes, the balance is difficult. I do talks in schools.
That's great. That's really important.
I talk about the Far East. Everybody talks mainly about Europe and the Nazis and D-Day, but not many people remember that there was over 100,000 British soldiers, well, not British, Allied soldiers, taken prisoner at the fall of Singapore. And 1 in 4 of those never came home.
So it's about recovering lost stories.
Exactly, it's recovering lost stories. And when I speak to 13, 14, 15-year-olds, I ask them how many knows about this, and I would get like about 3 people in a class of 28. Yeah.
And I suppose the important part about remembering is trying to help prevent anything like that happening again.
Indeed. Oh, indeed, indeed.
By remembering, we actually do move forward.
We do move forward. I mean, there's been a lot in the press recently with the 70th anniversary of VJ Day, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those things, it's important to remember, but we've got to move forward, as you say.
How would you relate the stories here and these ideas about conflict in the Far East to Liverpool particularly?
Well, there are several things here. Many people out there will have seen The Bridge on the River Kwai, the film The Bridge on the River Kwai that came out some years ago now. And there's a recent film came out called The Railway Man.
Okay, yes, absolutely.
And that's also based on that. Well, there's the Colonel on The Bridge on the River Kwai, which is Colonel Nicholson, was based on the true story of a Colonel Toucey.
Okay.
Colonel Philip Toucey, who was from Oxton on the Wirral. So that's his story. Okay. And the other issue is that many of the prisoners came back. Although my dad came back to Southampton, many ships came back into Liverpool and brought them back into Liverpool. And there is now a memorial at the pier head to those ships that came back. And also, you've got the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, who treated many of the men that came back with tropical diseases.
Yeah, of course. Because the suffering kind of went on, didn't it?
Exactly.
Really? Not just physical, but psychological as well. And not just for those who returned, but also for their families, I think.
Exactly. There was a lot of suffering from families. And there was a lot of men came back to families that men were unrecognisable. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of wives suffered who when their husbands came back.
Are you tempted to tell their stories?
Their stories have already been told. Okay. I won't go into that
what
now.
What are you working on at the moment?
I'm working on the history of my father's regiment.
Oh,
my father was in the East Surrey Regiment, and they were one of only 3 British infantry battalions that were out there. So I'm tracing the history of that regiment.
Okay, great.
Right through from 1937 when they went out to the Far East until the end of the war.
Oh, wow.
So I'm working on that one at the moment.
Okay, that's fantastic. So if you were to leave our viewers with one important thought that your work with Elizabeth Van Kampen and with John Wyatt has left you with, what would that be? What would be the message?
The message is to think deeply about what these people went through. Try and put yourself in that position that you may have been in had you been there at their ages. I mean, don't forget, John Wyatt was only about 20, 21 when all of this happened. Elizabeth Van Kampen was 16. Put yourself into that position and think what it must have been like, and pass this on to the next generation.
So remember and care and empathise, really.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cecil, for coming in and sharing your work with us. It's been really inspiring, and I'm really grateful to you for making vivid these 2 lives and hundreds of lives that these 2 lives represent.
Exactly. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Stay with us for part 2, when we preview the Liverpool Irish Festival and meet Luca Veste. Luca Veste is a writer of Italian and Scouse heritage. His debut novel, Dead Gone, and its sequel, The Dying Place, introduced us to the detective pairing of D.I. David Murphy and D.S. Laura Rossi. Both books are superior crime fiction, and he spoke with us recently about the 3rd book in the series, Bloodstream, which is about to be released.
My name's Luca Veste and I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Bloodstream. It's the 3rd in the Murphy and Rossi series. It's 2 detectives who investigate major crimes in the city of Liverpool. This book starts with the discovery of 2 bodies in the abandoned house in Anfield. They are reality TV stars who have become social media stars, as you see everywhere in society at the moment. What leads them to this place is what is the interest of the novel, and that is, you know, it looks at love and relationships and how lies and secrets can destroy those relationships without people even realising. And we have a serial killer who is now targeting people, and the question of the novel is, if you are being targeted for telling lies or keeping secrets in your relationship, would anyone survive? And that's the key to the novel, and that's the theme that I start with. That's how I start writing, is I have a theme in mind when I start, and this one starts with love and relationships. And, you know, these small lies to us that we kind of keep from our partners and things like that can seem tiny in comparison to bigger lies that other people hold, but they're still lies, and that's what people are keeping from who is someone who's supposed to be, you know, the absolute companion, you know, and the closest person to them in the world. And that's where the theme started for me, but it's also in a wider scale. It's about media and how media affects police investigations and things like that. You know, we live in a 24-hour news culture now where, you know, it's you know, always around us, and there's countless examples of reporters especially getting themselves into situations where they're telling people on the ground things that are happening in the police investigation rather than they're coming from an official source, which I find fascinating. You know, it's that idea that, you know, we have become almost investigators ourselves. We have our own opinions, and especially in social media now, you can see that as well, and blogs and things like that. People have become investigative reporters without even realising. And it's when you've got that kind of pressure on the police who are trying to find out, you know, how these people have died or what has happened in these situations. It's like, how can they deal with that when there's all this pressure coming from the outside as well, from people who haven't got the same information they have but believe that they know more than them. And I find that a fascinating subject to look at as well. I mean, this is the 3rd in the series. The first 2 were Dead Gone and The Dying Place, and they both looked at different things as well. You know, the first one, Dead Gone, was about death and how that kind of grief can affect people, and The Dying Place was about, you know, the dichotomy between the young and old generations and how that divide is becoming more and more apparent from, like, you have, youth unemployment and how that affects people, how they treat others people in on the streets and things like that. But you also have this older generation who believes that they went through harder times than they ever did, so why can't they pull the bootstraps up and, get on with it? And it's always interesting to find a theme like that where you can kind of explore things, and I think crime genre is very good for that kind of thing, where you can, look at these issues in society, frame it within a story which is almost absurd. A serial killer in Liverpool. I looked into it when I first started writing, and the last serial killer we had was in the 1800s, and it was a kind of Black Widow type of serial killer. It was like, someone who was murdering a husband each time she got married. But we kind of exported a couple as well. We had Robert Maudsley, and there's another one in Australia whose name kind of disappears from my head at the moment. But we've never really had that, and a lot of major cities in Liverpool, in England especially, don't really have examples of serial killers. It's much more of we tend to think like an American thing. But within crime fiction, we can use that kind of absurd, figure of the serial killer, but use it to explore, deeper issues. And that's what I really enjoy doing, is looking at, deeper issues within society, but make it entertaining. I like writing crime fiction that makes people think, and that's what my goal is to make people read these books and make their own decisions about what they believe is happening in them. And Bloodstream is out on the 22nd of October. It's the third in the series, with more to come.
The Liverpool Irish Festival returns this October, celebrating the finest in contemporary and traditional Irish culture and Liverpool's unique relationship with Ireland. The festival has something for everyone: talks and tours, music and dance, art, animation, literature, theatre and film. Fellow presenter Jerry Smith has a heavy involvement with the festival. He's overseeing a play, a musical performance and a film. We caught up with him during a break in rehearsals to learn more.
My involvement in the Irish Festival this year is a culmination of my involvement over the last 5 years or so. I've run film events, theatre events, musical events, and this year I'm doing a little bit of all of them. The first one is a play. It's a new play on the subject of James Joyce and his relationship with his lifelong partner, Nora Barnacle. And it's set in Dublin and Trieste in the autumn of 1909 when Joyce and Nora were apart, and they had a bit of a crisis in their relationship, and the letters were darting back and forth between these two cities. I've got a public lecture. Professor Keith Hopper from Oxford is coming up to do a public lecture on the Irish aeronautical engineer J.W. Dunn, who was a very wacky, far-out character from the 20th century, and who had all sorts of fantastic ideas about time travel and so on. The third event is a musical performance at the Blue Coat Arts Centre. Myself and my colleague will be performing excerpts from our album based on James Joyce's chamber music, which was the first book he published as a very young man in 1907, a book of poems. The fourth event is at Liverpool Central Library, and it's an event called Shelf Lives, and it's based on the rare holdings of the library itself. Got 3 academics coming along. They've chosen books from about the kind of late 19th, early 20th century period, books that are very rare and very difficult to acquire now. And they're going to be talking about these books, not in a kind of academic or literary sense so much, but more about the kind of availability of the texts and what they meant in the time and where they've been since. And the final event from this kind of basket of events is the premiere of a film based on the work of Flann O'Brien. It's a film called The Brother, which itself is based on a very successful stage play that's been running for about 4 years now in various locations around Europe. The first event is Shelf Lives, and that's at Liverpool Central Library on Friday the 16th of October, and that's running between 3 o'clock and 4:30. The second event is the play Nora and Jim, and that's on Saturday the 17th of October, and that's in the Joe H. Macon Drama Centre on Pilgrim Street in Liverpool. The third event is the James Joyce Chamber Music event, and that's at the Blue Coat Arts Centre on Tuesday the 20th of October, and that's running between 7:30 and 9 o'clock. The fourth event is the public lecture, and that's on Monday the 19th of October, and that's at 5:30 in the John Foster building, the LJMU John Foster building on Mount Pleasant. And the final event is the premiere of the film of The Brother, and that's in Fredericks on Hope Street beside the Philharmonic Pub, and that's on Sunday the 25th of October. I think I'm really looking forward to the play of Nora and Jim. It's a kind of fascinating story. Joyce is obviously a kind of hugely dominant figure from 20th century literature, but a lot less is known about his lifelong partner, Nora Barnacle, a woman with whom he was obsessed in all sorts of ways. So this story is really trying to give her back a voice in some respects, and it takes this kind of moment of crisis from their relationship and uses it as a lens to think about all his work, to think about Irish history in the 20th century. I'm involved with these 5 events really, and that's been quite exhausting, trying to organise those, trying to find venues, trying to book the acts themselves, the people themselves, trying to do publicity with the Liverpool Irish Festival, with the venues, with John Moores University. So that's been a real challenge. There's some fantastic music events running this year, and some good films as well. Well, I've always been a kind of a bit of an actor who has a real job, and then over the last couple of years, it's been the balance between those two has been transmogrifying a little bit, shall we say. The only acting I'm doing this year is in the film version of The Brother, which was shot in Liverpool earlier in the year. I play the role of a kind of slightly overexcited, mildly drunk Irishman from the 1950s, so it wasn't that difficult to get into character, but it was still a lot of fun. I think people will enjoy it. It's a good laugh, but also with kind of slightly dark overtones of the kind that you always find in the work of Flann O'Brien.
The Liverpool Irish Festival starts on October 15th across many venues in the city. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please do contact us at artsalive@baytvliverpool.com. We look forward to hearing from you. See you soon.